So, something that's kind of confusing but can lead to a wonderful amount of choice on our part is that even though something is the same point size, it can vary in x height. And particularly in different time periods or for different purposes, typefaces have different x heights. Ever since Helvetica in the mid 20th century, most people tend to be attracted to types with large X heights and big wide counters. The inside of that P or the inside of an E, the sort of enclosed space, is a counter. And in general, there's been a preference for that. I find that kind of limiting, but I think it's worth putting out there. And again, there are lots of other different variations you can find. So all of these are the same point size, but they look incredibly different when we compare them side by side. There's the thicker line weight or stroke in some of them, the differing X heights of all the different typefaces here, and the differing proportion between the cap height and the descenders. So although point size gives you a good sense of what will fit in a line as you're working on a specific application, there is a lot to play with that might go into your decision of which typeface to use. We don't often use this a lot in the Photoshop class, but I wanted to mention it. That's picas if you're going into journalism or if you're working with print in a column a lot. You'll be using picas a fair amount. And again, it's like the English foot. It's based on multiples of 6, which make it very easy to divide and multiply. So points and picas. Leading, it's one of those terms. Come back. One of those terms I like a lot because it harkens back to an older time, very material technology. When you'd set the distance between lines of type, you'd actually slip in narrow slats of lead between the actual type you were setting in lines. And so leading is a term that harkens back to that. We do love our traditions. In general, the 3 terms we might use when we're talking about leading. Set solid, which is generally considered to be a little bit too close to be very easy on the eye. If you look at that, if you look at the descender on the P on the top line and the dot on the I on the bottom line, or the descender on the Y in type and the ascender on the D, you can see they're becoming rather crowded. If you're using negative leading, you're likely to get collisions between ascenders and descenders, and you see that with both the P and the I and the Y and the D. And then positive leading, and generally on Microsoft Word or Adobe InDesign or something, leading will be set at 100 per 20% of the line of type. Now, if you're working with a title or you're working with a caption, you're working with a layout, you may find yourself adjusting the leading a little bit. Oh, and so with positive leading, particularly at 120%, we've got just enough space between ascenders and descenders that the eye has plenty of things to stop on. Kind of, I almost think it is as the eye grabs onto something. It needs a little negative space. Similarly with serifs, they might have had to do with pen writing technology originally, but they also can make text easier to read because the eye has these additional little points to focus on as it's taking things in. Kerns and kerning. Technically, a kern is just the part of the letter that extends into the space of another. And we have kerning because of the way the eye looks at negative space. And that example on the right, or above actually, even though those letters are kind of equally spaced, to the eye it looks wrong. To the eye it almost looks like there's 2 separate words there, a V and app. as a separate word. So what we do, and usually this is done automatically by most programs, is we kern the letter so it moves closer and there's less negative space. And I mentioned before typefaces and fonts. One sense you can get of how professionally a typeface or font is done is the sophistication of its kerning tables, particularly when you start considering languages other than English, where you have O's with umlauts and combinations like an Yggdrasil, the Norse world tree, world ash, that if you're familiar with Thor movies you might know about. And one situation where you may find yourself manually kerning, going into the controls and manually kerning, is when you're blowing something up. So particularly if the letter you're using is meant as body text, if the particular font you're using, the particular, something, let's go with Myriad Pro again, and you blow that up to a headline size, what doesn't look like a gap when it's at a body text size may look like a gap when you blow it up to headline size. And so you kern it, and it removes that negative space that we find so awkward. Tracking, pay attention if you want to try to cheat on papers. If you've got a paper where you just can't quite make as many pages as your professor wanted, the way most students try and fiddle with that is they go with a larger font size, or they make the leading larger. And that might have worked 15, 20 years ago, but most professors grew up with word processors, and most of them will spot that. So really, the sneakiest way to do this is to go to positive tracking. So instead of just adjusting the space between two letters, when you go to positive tracking, it will spread it out between all of the letters and incrementally increase the size. Similarly, when you want to scrunch something in, if you're trying to get it on a single page, the best way to do that is generally to go with negative tracking. Although I will point out, if you look at most newspaper text, it's actually 11-point text, sometimes even 10. And people tend to underestimate, or let's say overestimate, how large a typeface should be, a font should be for people to read. And generally, if you're trying to fit things in, 11-point is fine. Okay, unscheduled interruption by my dog.